Hey everyone, welcome to the Being Patient podcast. I'm Deborah Kahn, founder of Being Patient. When my mom was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, I decided to use my skills as a journalist in a different way. Frustrated by the lack of information on science and the inability to get different expert opinions, I decided to quit my job at the Wall Street Journal to create a better platform for people impacted by dementia. We are a community where news and information is created by our team of journalists. We ask tough questions and we simplify the science so that anyone can understand. We don't only cover disease, but delve into the latest research on what it takes to keep our brains healthy. We invite the experts and ask your questions. Here's today's podcast. I hope you enjoy it. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Being Patient Brain Talks. I'm Deborah Kahn, founder of Being Patient. This series is meant to connect experts in science and research with you directly so that you can ask any questions you have. Don't forget to sign up for our newsletter on beingpatient.com because that will tell you about talks like today's. Today, we're going to talk about dance and the brain, dance, yoga, just really movement in the brain and how it impacts the brain. We've known it has a positive impact, but I'm happy to see more and more research is going into this field. And hi, everyone. Hope you're enjoying our video. I'm Deborah Kahn, founder of Being Patient. Click on the link below to get access to our interactive video on the 7 stages of Alzheimer's. Now, back to our interview. Field, and joining us is Dr. Julia Basso. She's an assistant professor at Virginia Tech who is really delving into the body-brain connection. Julia, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So we were just talking a few minutes prior to starting this interview. And I love the fact that you really had a background in dance. You were telling me that in college you studied, you were a dancer who also studied neuroscience. So tell me a little bit about those early days and how you made that connection.
Sure. Well, I've been dancing my entire life, ever since I was about 3 or 4. So that's always been a consistent practice in my life. And in college, when I arrived at Middlebury College in Middlebury, Vermont, I really wanted to deepen that practice. And there is a wonderful dance program at Middlebury College, led by Andrea Olson and Penny Campbell at the time. And so that practice is really kind of integrated in the world of somatics. So really understanding the body and how to use the body as a tool and its interconnection with the nervous system. So already embedded in that information was all of this relationship between the body and brain. And neuroscience was just starting to kind of pop onto the scene at that time. As a matter of fact, I was one of the first neuroscience students at Middlebury College. It was an integration between biology and psychiatry, or psychology at the time. So neuroscience was new. And I decided to study both of these pathways, looking at the body through dance and movement, and then the brain. And at that time, people were like, well, how do those two things connect? But for me, it was always really integrated, the body, the brain, these interesting connections. And so then later on, pursuing my PhD in neuroscience, or in behavioral and neural science, I really started to understand that, well, one of the reasons why there was such a disconnect between the body and brain is because early on, we as scientists and as thinkers really had this disconnect between body and brain with the kind of the time of Rene Descartes and kind of mind-body dualism. And so now we're really starting to integrate how is it that the body affects the mind, affects the brain, and vice versa. So our lab, I'm the director of the Embodied Brain Lab at Virginia Tech, and we opened up in August 2021. And so we're really delving into the science of the body-brain connection.
So I love that you were so prescient, because I bet back then it was kind of like, what, like, what do you want to research?
Right.
But today there are very valid connections that you're talking about being studied in neuroscience. So tell me a little bit about the research that you are doing. I mean, you're actually scanning people's brains who are dancers' brains. So give us a little bit about what you are learning, and maybe some. I mean, I'm assuming you're getting validation for some of those early instincts that you had.
Yeah. So, well, a few years ago, I developed this hypothesis called the synchronicity hypothesis of dance. And so it was coming from my background in dance and especially in improvisation, and how when we engage in this work of improvisational movement, there are these emergent movement forms that come together. These kind of rhythms of people and music and presence of bodies in space. And so it was very much relating to the brain and neural oscillations and rhythms. And so I developed this hypothesis that states a few things, but essentially that dance and through movement practices, we can enhance neural synchrony or neural coordination between different parts of our brain. For example, dance enhances sensory and motor coordination. There's cognitive processes as we're engaging in choreography. There's creative and rhythmic processes, all these things. So the different brain areas kind of come together. They integrate, the flow of information is enhanced during dance. But also, so that's called intra-brain synchrony, the enhancement of brain flow or brain connectivity. But subsequently, when we dance with other people, we can actually enhance the link or the communication, the rhythms between two people's brains. And that's called interbrain synchrony. So this is something I'm really, really excited about. And what we do in the lab is that we study the brains of two or more people. So we've been studying dyads, and this can be mother-child relations. This could be romantic partners. We had Little Buck and his crew come through for the Memphis Juke in the show. We studied Little Buck's brain along with Eric, one of his premier dancers. And we actually were able to look at the synchronicity or the rhythms of the brain together while they danced. And these are such professional high-level dancers that when they're doing these mirroring practices, following one another, you can't tell who is following, who is leading. They're so synchronous in their movement. It was really beautiful to watch. So then we can look at the level of the brain, what's happening. And so we're starting to see that in professional level dancers, and even through some, we ran a interventional study where we trained improvisational dance. And what we're starting to see is that through these training practices, we can start to enhance the rhythms of the brain. And so
wait,
why
sorry.
would that? Yeah, go ahead.
I'm fascinated by this, but I want to back up a little bit because first of all, when you were looking at two people dancing together and you were looking inside their brains, or scanning their brains, did you see the same type of patterns, or what was it that you were seeing in terms of what was going on inside their brains?
That's right. So when you look at the brain signal through electroencephalography or through EEG, they look like sine waves. So these rhythms or these patterns. And when you look at kind of what comes out naturally or from the whole brain, you see these rhythms, fast rhythms, slow rhythms. And what we do through statistics is we take them apart and we look at, say, the alpha rhythm or the theta rhythm, these different frequencies. And what it means is that, say, if we look at theta activity, which would be between 4 to 8 hertz. And that's essentially the brain is operating for the action potentials or how the brain is firing 4 to 8 times per second, these populations of neurons, the flow of information in and out of these neurons. So what we're seeing is that at these particular rhythmic frequencies, the brains start to oscillate together in these same rhythmic patterns. And so not only are we seeing the flow of information within one individual brain, but between two brains. And we're very interested in if this, by enhancing the way that brains are rhythmically communicating with one another, if that can actually enhance social connection. And so that's kind of the end goal, right?
That is super interesting. Okay, so I have so many questions. I know you haven't shared everything, but we'll get to it. I just want to take it because you know so much more than the rest of us. But as you're speaking, what's occurring to me is maybe the same likely impact of meditation. So, for example, when we interviewed Sarah Lazard, who's a Harvard expert on and studying meditation in the brain. What she told us is one of the reasons why they're finding that meditation is so good for the brain is because you're actually operating at a different wavelength when you meditate, right?
That's right.
And different patterns, different wavelengths are very good for the brain. That strengthens neuroplasticity, things like that. So is it the same when I'm fascinated when you started to talk about different wavelengths. Tell us a little bit about that interaction and what does that mean for brain health overall?
Sure. So take the example of meditation. So when you start meditating, right, and you go into this meditative space, maybe eyes are closed, there is a particular waveform called the alpha activity that really starts to come on board. And so you're bringing, when we're anxious or when we're kind of in this hyper cognitive activity, we're in that kind of mode for a lot of our day, right? Like the sympathetic activity. And so through meditation, we can bring us a bit into parasympathetic, calm the nervous system, calm the brain waves down, get them to slow down. Right. And so this idea of neuroplasticity, being able to utilize the mind and being able to control your brain rhythms is very important, right? Because the idea is flexibility. We want to be able to flexibly navigate the world, right? If in our day-to-day we're working, we're really stressed out, right? And then we want to come home, we want to calm down. We don't want to stay in that sympathetic, hyper-activated mode. We want to be able to come home, calm down, relax, right? Maybe without a glass of wine, to do it naturally. I think, which would be really wonderful, right? So it's this ability to utilize meditation, dance, these other practices to help create a flexible nervous system. And so through these practices, when we intentionally say, okay, we're going to meditate now, we're going to, from whatever state we're in, we're going to practice pranayama, we're going to practice deep breathing practices, right? Then we can utilize those practices to help calm us down. And when we go, and I have a study showing that when we go into normal everyday life and encounter what are called psychosocial stressors, so this could be like you get a phone call from your boss, you get that email that really hypes you up, right? That your sympathetic nervous system, you're going to have actually a decreased response, a decreased stress response when you go into your everyday. So that, I think, is the really cool thing about it. You know, it's great to meditate, it's great to do all these practices, but if they're actually changing your nervous system such that you can go into the world and then have a more calm response to what's going on, to our stressful lives, I think that's the really important thing.
So when people are dancing, are their brains working differently than when they're just maybe reading a book? What's happening what is that brain body connection that makes like the patterns of dancing or the motion and the movement so good for our brains?
Yeah. So again, when we are at rest and when we're kind of in this meditative state, it's more this alpha activity, kind of this restful states. And we're seeing that when we start to dance, and we just presented this work at the American College of Sports Medicine conference last week, and we had little bug brain on display there. We're starting to see that it's driving to more of this theta activity. And interestingly enough, that when people are watching or observing dance, and we as dancers, any of us dancers out there, we know this. When you watch another dancer, your brain does not look like it's resting. Your brain actually looks like it's dancing, which is a really cool thing. It's this thing called the action observation network or the mirror neuron network. And so we're in our heads kind of thinking and looking and seeing like it is that we're dancing, you know? So I think that was a really cool thing. And so theta activity, it's this type of activity that comes on board when we start to navigate, engage in something called spatial navigation. And so we're starting to move through the world, process time and space a little bit differently. And it's a thing that's very much connected to our memory systems, especially in an area of the brain called the hippocampus. And so a lot of work in the rodent world has been done in this field. So as we kind of navigate through time and space, theta activity comes on board, and it helps us to learn and remember information, kind of consolidate information.
Is it the same way that running, like exercise, helps us with the hippocampus as well? Like I know in animal studies that they found that you've actually added white matter or gray matter. I can't remember which matter it is, but that you've added more matter to your hippocampus, the area that's responsible for memory. Is it the same? Is it much like that?
So it's interesting in that way, right? We may hypothesize that may be happening, because if we're seeing these now, EEG, the work that I do, we can only record the cortex, the cortical brain matter, which is our outer brain matter, not the inside. We would utilize tools like magnetic resonance imaging or functional magnetic resonance imaging to do that. But studies have shown in rodents and some in humans that there's this increased neurogenesis, like you were saying. So the growth and birth of these new neurons, and that they integrate within the circuits, and that the circuits are themselves more active and alive. They're more responsive, say. And so we've done that, and we're doing some of that work. I do that with my my husband and my science partner, Dr. Daniel English. So we look at some of that, what's going on in the hippocampus while rodents run, right, while they're exercising. And we have some new work showing that the hippocampus actually codes or encodes for the motivation to engage in exercise. We're actually seeing that there's distinct changes while you sleep that predicts your future exercise, which is really fascinating.
Wait, yeah. Say that again. Wait, I say that again. That sounded like, whoa, we need to hear more about that. So there's actually.
So if we train a rodent to run and get them exercising and they're really loving their exercise, right? We can actually predict by the activity in the hippocampus while they sleep how much they are going to run the next day.
Wow.
Yeah. Through something called the sharp wave ripple. It's one of the fastest oscillations or fastest rhythms in the mammalian brain.
So, okay. And, granted, these are in animal studies, which don't always translate into human studies, as we know.
Yeah.
But what are you learning about from your human studies? I mean, what are some of the theories that you can make now based on scanning dancers' brains?
That's a good question. So what we're starting to see, especially, so I'm a behavioral neuroscience. So my first thing is that I always look at behavior, and I always want to see an outcome of behavior before I look at the brain. And what we're seeing is that, and interestingly enough, that dance seems to be training some of these social factors. So dance is increasing empathy, it's increasing mindfulness, it's decreasing stress. It's helping the social connectivity piece, which is really cool. So even with a single acute session of dance, there's impacts at the level of mental health. So we see decreased levels of depression and anxiety, and also increased levels of self-esteem and positive affect. So I love that when I have an intervention that decreases your negative affective states and increases your positive affective states, and then also increases your social connection. And that was some of the work we did during the pandemic, when we couldn't be together, right, in person. And so our whole world turned online. And so we even did this through the screen. We were dancing online together, we called it. And we found that dance enhanced the mental health aspects and increased the social connectivity aspects. And those who gained the most in their mental health also showed the biggest gains in their social connectivity. So I call this the body-mind community connection. And so now we're starting to investigate some of those behavioral outcomes with these brain outcomes. And hopefully, and our hypothesis is such that we're going to connect these social outcomes to the relationship to interbrain synchrony. And our first findings are that it's happening at this alpha theta activity, kind of where meditation puts you.
So is it much like, for example, they say learning a musical instrument or learning a new language is really good for our brains because it does increase that neuroplasticity. Is dancing, because you're thinking in terms of patterns, it's a different way, right? You're thinking in terms of motion and patterns. Is that equivalent to learning another language or, playing a musical instrument you never knew how to play? Is that same? Do we know of that same benefit? Does it have the same benefit to the brain?
Yeah, I would think so. Dance is this form of nonverbal communication, which is really interesting. And so we're looking at, so when you have, say, from mother and child in early neurodevelopment, and we practice this thing called the brain dance. And so the dance practices that we engage in are very connected to neurodevelopment. We go through all of these kind of physical stages. For example, the core distal patterning, the cross-lateral patterning. So we go through all of these different movement stages. They're evolutionary movement patterns, but they're also neurodevelopmental movement patterns. And then as dancers, we train for these things, again, kind of in either childhood or adolescence or adulthood. So we go through these different neurodevelopmental movement patterns, and we very much think that these things are connected to more, so the nonverbal is very then connected to the verbal and kind of these social connectivity things, because that's what happens in mother-child connectivity. So for example, when mother ease or as a baby is being patted and rocked by their mother, there are these nonverbal things that then later turn into that socio-emotional connectivity. So we're training for that in dance, and we do think, just like in language or in music or some of these other, whether it's nonverbal or verbal communication, that these things do overlap because they're engaging some of the same brain networks, and especially in dance, I think it engages sensory, it engages motor, it engages cognitive, very similar to some of these other, well, either language or creative practices like music, for example. And so I do think there would be some similar benefits, but the research really hasn't been done.
Right. And this was actually a viewer just brought this up, and it was actually on my mind to ask you this next. Debbie has said, our song is Love Will Keep Us Alive by the Eagles. He loves to dance to that one. He has Alzheimer's and Lewy body dementia. So we can only sway, but it's a connection.
Yes.
So do we know what role music and even dance, I mean, that kind of music, like movement connection has in turn, when we look at it through the eyes of somebody who has been diagnosed with dementia?
Yeah, it's a hugely important question, and something we've been very interested in. One of the projects that the lab has ongoing is a project on music therapy for individuals with Alzheimer's disease and related dementias and their caregivers. And so we're very interested in how music and some of these, if you don't have language, in the absence of language, whether that would be a child hasn't developed language or in later stages of dementia when there's language loss, right? How can we communicate? And so we're thinking that movement and music might be one of these ways to do that and to create this interbrain synchrony or interpersonal synchrony, especially important for someone with Alzheimer's disease and their caregiver or other kind of relations. And so, yeah, and I was just reading this recently, that some of our memory for language, or maybe our episodic memory, might be shared in kind of different memory networks than our memory for music. And so, and these things might be preserved for longer. That's one of the kind of hypotheses about why we're able to connect through music. Also that yesterday I was in a music therapy session with individuals with dementia, and we were playing the drums together. We were playing something where we communicated through drumming. So first I would go, then one of the individuals would go, right? And we would go back and forth. And even though that person wasn't speaking, we were able to communicate through drumming. And so we had a conversation, and it was really magical and wonderful. So I would say, in the absence of language, for whatever reason, that we can utilize these nonverbal forms of communication, like dance, like music, to communicate, to connect.
So, and that before this live interview, you and I were talking about, I relayed the story of somebody I've interviewed who has been diagnosed with dementia, but was not aware until her friend said, take a painting class. And she unleashed the artist within her that she didn't know existed. So what was striking to me about that was the fact that, they always say people who have been diagnosed with dementia don't learn new things, but I'm like, wait a second, that's not right, because creativity for some reason seems to be something that can flourish even despite a dementia diagnosis. What do we know about that, the creative part of the brain and how it's impacted by dementia?
Yeah, so with dementia and some of these kind of Alzheimer's disease and mild cognitive impairment, even early on, we see that there's a loss in what are called our executive functioning network. So that would be our prefrontal cortex, our hippocampus, these kind of central seats of learning and memory. There are our most plastic brain regions. So these are the brain regions that respond most readily to exercise, to physical activity. So there are some other networks, right, that kind of harbor creativity, that may be preserved, that might not be degenerating or having that neurodegenerative process occur, that can sustain. So the brain, right, is very plastic, and we know that the brain, when in the absence of, say, a part of the brain, if there's a brain injury, traumatic brain injury, the brain preserves itself. So maybe another part takes over. So in the absence of some of these, the ability to form episodic memories or kind of remember information, there might be other kinds or modes that take over. And creativity might be one of these ways, and might be like an important integral way to tap in. We know that right early on in evolution, one of the first things we were doing to communicate with each other in the absence of verbal language was moving, was dancing, was creating rhythms and patterns. So it's a very early form of communication, and just thinking theoretically, like, maybe we utilize those techniques and go back to those early forms of communication to really tap into health and wellness for individuals that don't have that capacity anymore.
That's super interesting. And for those of us who don't really have a lot of rhythm, should we start to try to dance? Is it like attempting to dance? Will it have the same impact as, a professional dancer? What do we know about that?
Yeah, definitely. We work with novice dancers all the time. And actually, in a lot of these studies, people who are coming in totally new to the experience are often the ones that have the biggest boost, the most, right, quickly. So start dancing, start getting into music classes and all these creative practices, and you will see a big boost pretty quickly. Yeah, so I think, being a novice at something is a wonderful space for entry. Same thing with meditation.
Where is the next phase of your research going? I mean, what should we look out for in future coming from your research?
Yeah, so we're working with a whole range of individuals. Our newest study is mother-child dance for moms with PTSD and postpartum depression. We're looking at whether we can use some of these tools to enhance that connectivity between that dyad. We have a range of studies going on in individuals with disabilities and autism spectrum disorder, looking to see if dance can help to enhance social connectivity. We partner with different community partners like Step Virginia, for example. And we just started work with Grounded, a program out in Memphis, Tennessee, to work with individuals, vulnerable populations in adolescence and in kind of the school system who are exposed to violent communities, for example, and just seeing if we can use dance and these creative arts practices to enhance health and wellness in a range of individuals.
Okay, and just last questions, because this one just came in, and I think it's a good one for those of us who do yoga. Shelley is asking, does yoga affect the brain the same way that dance does? She does hot yoga weekly and would love to be enriching her brain as well as her body.
Yes, I love hot yoga. I try to do it as often as I can. So that's an awesome question, an awesome scientific question. I think unknown as of yet, but yoga is one of these things. Yoga is a practice that incorporates, of course, the mind, body, spiritual connection. And so it incorporates these meditative practices, which I think are, and a lot of the dance, we do that too, especially in the improvisational dance. but yoga kind of encapsulates that mind-body spiritual connection. And so it's studies have shown that it helps to enhance prefrontal cortex functioning. It helps to enhance hippocampal functioning and even size. So these learning and memory centers, important for attention, how we think, how we plan, all of that, that there's even functional connectivity between these centers. So again, enhancing the flow of communication, that is also what we're thinking about and looking at in dance. And importantly, with that meditation piece, what ends up happening is that some of our emotional centers of the brain, like the amygdala, for example, we haven't talked much about the amygdala, but there's actually a decrease in activation, which our behavioral studies have been showing. So that as we encounter these daily stressors, our emotional centers don't become as hyperactivated. So we actually have a calmer nervous system. Mm-hmm.
It is fascinating. And thank you so much, Dr. Julia Basso, for joining us. We keep us updated. I find this incredibly fascinating, and you've certainly motivated me to go out and take a dance class. So,
oh, thanks. That's important. Yeah.
Yeah. But please do keep us abreast of your research. I'm glad you're doing it. We're getting more and more validation for really strategies to improve all of our brain health. Dance, it being one of those. So thank you so much for sharing with us.
Oh, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
And for those of you who missed part of this interview, of course, we're going to post it on beingpatient.com. Don't forget to sign up for our newsletter. Our newsletter tells you when these talks are coming. Thanks, everyone, for your comments and your questions. We'll see you next time.
Bye.
Well, I hope you enjoyed today's podcast. For more information on upcoming interviews, don't forget to sign up for our newsletter at beingpatient.com. That's beingpatient.com. And send us any feedback you may have, whether it's someone you want us to interview or any comment about our podcast series. You can do so by emailing info@beingpatient.com. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'm Deborah Kahn.